in identical fashion to the results returned when computing dust cloud cooling in the Martian atmosphere. The cloud high above the planet would be heated while the planet below would cool drastically. Golitsyn presented his intent to publish this Martian-derived Earth analog model to the Andropov-instigated Committee of Soviet Scientists in Defense of Peace Against the Nuclear Threat in May 1983, an organization that Golitsyn would later be appointed a position of vice chairman of. The establishment of this committee was done with the expressed approval of the Soviet leadership with the intent to expand controlled contacts with Western nuclear freeze activists. 98. Having gained this committee's approval, in September 1983, Golitsyn published the first computer model on the nascent nuclear winter effect in the widely read Herald of the Russian Academy of Sciences. 99. On the 31st of October 1982, Golitsyn and Ginzburg's model and results were presented at the conference on the World After Nuclear War, hosted in Washington, D.C. 97. Both Golitsyn, 99, and Sagan, 100, had been interested in the cooling on the dust storms on the planet Mars in the years preceding their focus on nuclear winter. Sagan had also worked on Project A119 in the 1950s-1960s, in which he attempted to model the movement and longevity of a plume of a lunar soil. After the publication of Twilight at Noon in 1982, 101, the TUPS team have said that they began the process of doing a one-dimensional computational modeling study of the atmospheric consequences of nuclear war /soot in the stratosphere, though they would not publish a paper in Science magazine until late December 1983. 102. The phrase nuclear winter had been coined by Turco just prior to publication. 103. In this early paper, TUPS used assumption-based estimates on the total smoke and dust emissions that would result from a major nuclear exchange, and with that, began analyzing the subsequent effects on the atmospheric radiation balance and temperature structure as a result of this quantity of assumed smoke. To compute dust and smoke effects, they employed a one-dimensional microphysics /radiative transfer model of the Earth's lower atmosphere, up to the mesopause, which defined only the vertical characteristics of the global climate perturbation. Interest in the environmental effects of nuclear war, however, had continued in the Soviet Union after Golitsyn's September paper, with Vladimir Alexandrov and G.I. Stenshikov also publishing a paper in December 1983 on the climatic consequences, although in contrast to the contemporary TUPS paper, this paper was based on simulations with a three-dimensional global circulation model. 54. 2 years later, Alexandrov disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Richard Turco and Starley L. Thompson were both critical of the Soviet research. Turco called it primitive and Thompson said it used obsolete use computer models. 104. Later they were to rescind these criticisms and instead applauded Alexandrov's pioneering work, saying that the Soviet model shared the weaknesses of all the others. 12. In 1984, the World Meteorological Organization, WMO, commissioned Golitsyn and Anna Phillips to review the state of the science. They found that studies generally assumed a scenario where half of the world's nuclear weapons would be used, 5,000 mount, destroying approximately 1,000 cities, and creating large quantities of carbonaceous smoke 1 to 1,014 G being most likely, with a range of 0.26 for 1,014 G, NOS, TUPS assumed 2.25 1,014. The smoke resulting would be largely opaque to solar radiation but transparent to infrared, thus cooling the Earth by blocking sunlight, but not creating warming by enhancing the greenhouse effect. The optical depth of the smoke can be much greater than unity. Forest fires resulting from non-urban targets could increase aerosol production further. Dust from near-surface explosions against ardent targets also contributes. Each megaton equivalent explosion could release up to 5 million tons of dust, but most would quickly fall out. High-altitude dust is estimated at 0.11 million tons per megaton equivalent of explosion. Burning of crude oil could also contribute substantially. 105. The 1D radiative convective models used in these studies produced a range of results, with cooling up to 1542 degrees Celsius between 14 and 35 days after the war, with a baseline of about 20 degrees Celsius. Somewhat more sophisticated calculations using 3D GCMs produced similar results. Temperature drops of about 20 degrees C though with regional variations. 54, 106. All calculations show large heating, up to 80 degrees Celsius, at the top of the smoke layer at about 10 kilometers, 6.2 mi. This implies a substantial modification of the circulation there and the possibility of advection of the cloud in low latitudes and the southern hemisphere. 1990. In a 1990 paper entitled Climate and Smoke, an appraisal of nuclear winter, TUPS gave a more detailed description of the short and long-term atmospheric effects of a nuclear war using a three-dimensional model. Smiley 107. First 1 to 3 months 10-25% of soot injected is immediately removed by precipitation, while the rest is transported over the globe in 1 to 2 weeks. Scope figures for July: smoke injection 22 degrees C drop in mid-latitudes, 10 degrees Celsius drop in humid climates, 75% decrease in rainfall in mid-latitudes, light level reduction of 0% in low latitudes to 90% in high smoke injection areas. Scope figures for winter: smoke injection temperature drops between 3 and 4 degrees Celsius. Following 1 to 3 years, 25-40% of injected smoke is stabilized in atmosphere. Smoke stabilized for approximately 1 year. Land temperatures of several degrees below normal. Ocean surface temperature between 2 and 6 degrees Celsius. Ozone depletion of 50% leading to 200% increase in UV radiation incident on surface. Kuwait wells in the First Gulf War. The Kuwaiti oil fires were not just limited to burning oil wells, one of which is seen here in the background, but burning oil lakes seen in the foreground also contributed to the smoke plumes, particularly the sootiest forward/blackest of 10.108. One of the major results of TUPS' 1990 paper was the reiteration of the team's 1983 model that 100 oil refinery fires would be sufficient to bring about a small-scale, but still globally deleterious nuclear winter. 110. Following Iraq's invasion of Kuwait and Iraqi threats of igniting the country's approximately 800 oil wells, speculation on the cumulative climatic effect of this, presented at the World Climate Conference in Geneva that November in 1990, ranged from a nuclear winter-type scenario, to heavy acid rain and even short-term immediate global warming. 111. In articles printed in the Wilmington Morning Star and the Baltimore Sun newspapers in January 1991, prominent authors of nuclear winter papers Richard P. Turco, John W. Burks, Carl Sagan, Alan Robock and Paul Crutzen collectively stated that the expected catastrophic nuclear winter-like effects with continental-sized effects of sub-freezing temperatures as a result of the Iraqis going through with the threats of igniting 300 to 500 pressurized oil wells that could subsequently burn for several months. 112, 113, as threatened. The wells were set on fire by the retreating Iraqis in March 1991, and the 600 or so burning oil wells were not fully extinguished until the 6th of November 1991. 8. months after the end of the war, 114, and they consumed an estimated 6 million barrels of oil per day at their peak intensity. When Operation Desert Storm began in January 1991, coinciding with the first few oil fires being lit, Drs. Fred Singer and Carl Sagan discussed the possible environmental effects of the Kuwaiti petroleum fires on ABC News program Nightline. Sagan again argued that some of the effects of the smoke could be similar to the effects of a nuclear winter, with smoke lofting into the stratosphere, beginning around 48,000 feet, 15,000 m, above sea level in Kuwait, resulting in global effects. He also argued that he believed the net effects would be very similar to the explosion of the Indonesian volcano Tambora in 1815, which assaulted in the year 1816, being known as the year without a summer. Smoke plumes from a few of the Kuwaiti oil fires on April 7, 1991. The maximum assumed extent of combined plumes from over 600 fires during the period of February 15 to 30th of May 1991, area available. 108, 109, only about 10% of all the fires, mostly corresponding with those that originated from oil-axe produced pure black soot-filled plumes. 25% of the fires emitted white to grey plumes, while every remaining emitted plumes with colors between grey and black. 108, Sagan listed modeling outcomes that forecast effects extending to South Asia, and perhaps to the Northern Hemisphere as well. Sagan stressed this outcome was so likely that it should affect fewer plans. 115, Singer, on the other hand, anticipated that the smoke would go to an altitude of about 3,000 feet, 910 m, and then rained out after about 3 to 5 days, thus limiting the lifetime of the smoke. Both height estimates made by Singer and Sagan turned out to be wrong, albeit with Singer's narrative being closer to what transpired, with the comparatively minimal atmospheric effects remaining limited to the Persian Gulf region, with smoke plumes, in general, 108, lofting to about 10,000 feet, 3,000 m, and a few as high as 20,000 feet, 6,100 m. 116, 117, Sagan and his colleagues expected that a self-lofting of the city smoke would occur when it absorbed the sun's heat radiation, with little to no scavenging occurring, whereby the black particles of soot would be heated by the sun and lifted forward/lofted higher and higher into the air, thereby injecting the soot into the stratosphere, a position where they argued it would take years for the sun-blockage effect of this aerosol of soot to fall out of the air, and with that catastrophic ground-level cooling and agricultural effects in Asia and possibly the Northern Hemisphere as a whole. 118, in a 1992 follow-up, Peter Hobbs and others had observed no appreciable evidence for the nuclear winter. Teams predicted massive self-lofting effect and the oil fire smoke clouds contained less soot than the nuclear winter modeling team had assumed. 119. The atmospheric scientist tasked with studying the atmospheric effect of the Kuwaiti fires by the National Science Foundation, Peter Hobbs, stated that the fire's modest impact suggested that some numbers, used to support the nuclear winter hypothesis, were probably a little overblown. 120, Hobbs found that at the peak of the fires, the smoke absorbed 75 to 80% of the sun's radiation. The particles rose to a maximum of 20,000 feet, 6,100 m, and when combined with scavenging by clouds, their smoke had a short residency time of a maximum of a few days in the atmosphere. 121. Pre-war claims of wide-scale, long-lasting, and significant global environmental effects were thus not borne out, and found to be significantly exaggerated by the media and speculators. 122, with climate models for those not supporting the nuclear winter hypothesis at the time of the fires predicting only more Localized effects such as a daytime temperature drop of -10 degrees C within 200 kilometers of the source. 123. Sagan later conceded in his book The Demon Haunted World that his predictions obviously did not turn out to be correct. It was pitch black at noon and temperatures dropped 6 degrees Celsius over the Persian Gulf. But not much smoke reached stratospheric altitudes and Asia was spared. 124. The idea of oil well and oil reserve smoke pluming into the stratosphere serving as a main contributor to the nuclear winter